We are in Matthew 24. We're looking at questions that Jesus asked. Let me get to Matthew 24. We got started. There are a couple of questions here in 24 that Jesus asks, and I was thinking about this when Rob and I were some of our lessons last week. I think it was Sunday morning, particularly pointing out that Jesus, all the times he was asked questions, very, very rarely just gave a direct answer. And it's not that he was evading questions. It's not that he didn't value the question, but it's the idea of helping someone to discover the answer as opposed to just giving the answer. And a lot of times he would answer questions with a question, or sometimes multiple questions, in order to help people to come to know the truth. So, when you see questions Jesus asked, a lot of times these are in response to a question he was asked. So bear that in mind as we go along. And in Matthew 24, the first question that he's going to ask in this chapter, and again, we covered this briefly a couple of weeks ago, but because these are in the same context, it's worth at least mentioning again. Jesus goes out. He's been teaching in the temple, and he's been dealing with some of the religious leaders. I see people fanning, and it is a little toasty in here, isn't it? You just bump that down just a little. Is that okay, Robert, if I do that? It's amazing how, when I'm here early on a Sunday morning, how different the thermostat set on 72 feels versus when people get here. So in Matthew 24, Jesus, he's been teaching in the temple. He's been dealing with some of the religious leaders. Some of them have asked him questions. And you see in that context, 21, 22, he's not answering their questions. A lot of times he asks them a question in return. They want to know, by what authority do you do these things? That's a good question. It's not that was a bad question to ask. It's a very good question, very valid question. But he says, well, let me ask you a question. And it's kind of, we talked about that. I don't want to reteach that question. But it's sort of like, okay, well, you're concerned about authority. Well, let me ask you a question. The baptism of John, whence was it? From heaven or of man? And so now they're kind of in a bind. Well, if we say it's from heaven, he's going to want to know why we didn't obey. and if we say of men, they feared the people because the people took John for a prophet. And so they say, well, we just can't say. So Jesus says, well, I'm not going to answer your question. They were not asking sincerely, of course. Here, he's dealing with his disciples. And so they are leaving the temple now. He's been doing all that teaching for several chapters, including that denunciation of the scribes and the Pharisees in chapter 23. They're going out from the temple. The disciples came to show him the buildings of the temple. And so it's as we pointed out I'll probably say last week before it's over, but you know what I mean, 2 weeks ago. We had our meeting last week. It's kind of like they're saying, boy, isn't this magnificent? And again, it was. The temple structure was amazing. Built first by Solomon, and it went through a lot of changes. Some of that was because of invaders that would come in. Some of that was because of kings that they were not faithful followers of God, and so they would sometimes take things out of the house of God. Solomon, of course, was sort of the zenith, the apex of the Jewish kingdom, and Solomon's wealth was just, it's hard to describe. It was so much. And so there are all these golden items, furnishings within the temple, and sometimes kings of Judah would get into a situation. Maybe it's being attacked by the northern kingdom of Israel after the kingdoms had split into north and south. And they might say, well, this king of Israel is pretty strong. He's coming against me with an army. And so they take some of the gold from the temple, send it to Assyria, send it to Syria. Two different nations, of course, Assyria, Syria. Sometimes one, sometimes the other. Sometimes send it to Egypt. Hey, help me out here. Here's some money. Here's some gold. Help me out to defeat this king of Israel. Sometimes it was a king of another place like Syria. And so they might send gold to Egypt or somewhere like that. But of course, ultimately the temple gets destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and his forces, Babylon. They come in because of Israel, Judah, their disobedience. The temple is destroyed. 70 years of captivity, just as Jeremiah prophesied. They come back from captivity. They rebuild the temple. They rebuild the city. They started to, right? And they kind of left off. And so God sends Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Those are all kind of within that same general time frame to stir up the people. Haggai especially saying, is it time for you to dwell in your sealed houses? And this house, talking about the Lord's house, the temple, lies waste. So consider your ways, Haggai says. And so the people, to their credit, they listened, they were stirred up, and they finished the temple. And when we read about this in Haggai, also some of this in Ezra, what's unique about when they finish rebuilding the temple? Does anybody remember this and know where I'm going? There were shouts of joy, right? They finished rebuilding the temple, but there were also cries, wailing. Why? Well, some of the older folks that remembered the glory of Solomon's temple, and they say, it's not that they weren't excited or happy, but they just remember how magnificent Solomon's temple was in comparison. And they're kind of like, it just doesn't hold a candle to that. And it's interesting because the prophet Haggai is going to say to him, consider this house, the Lord's house, this rebuilt temple. You may think it's not much, but he says there's coming a house that is going to be so glorious that it'll make this and Solomon's temple pale in glory. And he's talking about what? He's ultimately looking to the church, the house of God, not a physical structure, but a household, the household of God. And that was, of course, God's promise to David when David originally wanted to build the temple, and God told him, no, your son's going to build it. But he says to David, I'm going to build you a house. And so, again, a prophecy of the church. Later on, of course, the temple it'll still, even the rebuilt temple is going to suffer at the hands of some of the wicked enemies of God. And by the way, during that rebuilding of the temple, we'll talk a little bit this morning in our worship hour about the Samaritans. And that's where really the hostility between the Jews and the Samaritans sort of really reached I don't know if I'd say it reached a fever pitch at that point, but that's where it really, that just real bad friction began, at least. Sometimes the Jews didn't like the Samaritans just because they viewed them as not pure Jews. Sometimes it was because of that alone. But a lot of it comes from the rebuilding of the temple after captivity, because you have people like Sanballat, and originally they come and they say, oh, we're going to help you. And the Jews say, you don't have any part in this, because they weren't following God's law faithfully. So they said, you can't partner with us in this. Well, that made them angry. Instead of considering their ways and doing what God says and what God would have them to do, they get angry and they start trying to hinder the rebuilding of the temple. And so that kind of set the stage. There's a lot of friction from that point going forward. But you have Antiochus Epiphanes, and we've talked about him before. That's kind of in the period we sometimes call between the testaments or intertestamental period. But along comes, not long before the opening of the New Testament history, this fellow named Herod the Great, self-titled Herod the Great, right? These kings were a lot of times they were very humble men, and they gave themselves titles like Antiochus Epiphanes, and, meaning Antiochus the glorious, like he considered himself some sort of god. And you have Herod, who calls himself Herod the Great, but that's how he's remembered in history, but to distinguish him from numerous other Herods. But Herod, he decides that and Herod was an interesting fellow because he was very, very wicked in many ways, but he also is, and in fact, even in secular history, he's remembered for his building projects. A prolific builder of things in and around Judea. One of the projects that he was and is most remembered for is the temple. Over 40 years, I think I read it just this past week, I think it was like 46 years or so in the building. And I mean, it was magnificent. Herod wanted these buildings, and I don't want, it's easy to talk about somebody who's not here to defend himself. History tells us a lot of things about Herod that there's no denying he had serious problems. But I just say that to say this: a lot of Herod's building projects, such as, you think, well, why would a wicked man build the temple of God? He wanted to be remembered for that. And so there's even sometimes ego and hubris in otherwise benevolent projects such as that. He wanted to be remembered as he's the guy that made this glorious temple of the Jews. He considered himself King of the Jews. In fact, that's why he's going to be so upset when he hears there's been born one who is King of the Jews. The wise men come looking. We're here we came to worship and to see the King of the Jews. Herod's kind of like, I'm right here. King of the Jews? Somebody's been born King of the Jews? And so when he realizes he's been deceived by the wise men, he's going to send out and just slaughter 2 years and under, all the baby boys. Just going to make sure. Jesus probably, most scholars estimate maybe one or so at the time, but Herod's going to give a window. He's going to say 2 years old and under, I'm going to make sure I get this so-called King of the Jews. So, again, you're dealing with a guy that he's got problems. But he rebuilds this temple, and it's magnificent. And so the disciples are talking to Jesus as they leave the temple, and it's kind of like, they're walking out, and Herod even expanded the temple. It was a large structure under Solomon, but it's massive, this temple that Herod rebuilt. When the Jews rebuilt it after captivity, much smaller than Solomon's, but when Herod comes along, he says, hey, I'm going to make it. You could just hear somebody like Herod saying, oh, I'm going to make it better than Solomon's. So he has, it's just a magnificent structure. So perhaps they're outside the temple proper. Perhaps they may be outside the entire structure. We don't know for sure. But they say to Jesus that they're showing him the buildings of the temple. I may have had something in my notes. I was thinking there was another reference. Mark 13:2, where they say, do you see these great buildings? So it's kind of like they're saying to Jesus, man, isn't this magnificent? And that's kind of ironic in itself, right? Because Jesus came to earth from heaven. And Hebrews 1:1-3 tells us he is the architect of everything, by whom the worlds were made. He upholds all things by the word of his power, we're told in Colossians 1. And by him all things consist, Colossians 1. So, kind of ironic to say to Jesus, isn't this magnificent? But Jesus, he just makes a statement. See ye not all these things? And that's the question there in verse 2. New King James has it, do you not see all these things? And of course he's going to go on to say, verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now, again, we pointed this out 2 weeks ago. They respond to that with a question, or questions, depending on how it's understood. And it really doesn't matter. Again, we mentioned this 2 weeks ago. Some people say, well, they asked 2 questions. Some people say they asked 1 question. Some people say they asked 3 questions. And you can see that in verse 3. As he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came into him privately. So now they've gone from, it's not far to the Mount of Olives from the temple structure. But they've made that statement to Jesus. You see all these buildings? And Jesus says, Well, do you see all these things, and not one stone will be left on top of another? And again, it's not far to the Mount of Olives, but there is a little time period intervening for them to get to the Mount of Olives. And so as Jesus sits on the Mount of Olives, the disciples come to him privately, and they say, in other words, whatever time frame has passed, it'd be at least several minutes, depending on what pace they're walking. Probably weren't walking that fast because they're not really in a hurry. They're not trying to get somewhere on a schedule. And so they're probably leisurely walking and talking. You get the impression here. The Bible doesn't tell us specifically, but I think we can at least say some of this is very much implied by the text. Probably Jesus didn't say much between that temple structure and the Mount of Olives. The disciples, however, were seemingly busy in conversation. Not with Jesus, but among themselves. What is he talking about? He said not one stone left on top of another? And you could just kind of picture them, talking. What does he mean by that? I don't know. Ask him. You ask him. One stone left on top of another. This temple, it's magnificent. And maybe one of them says, that's got to be the end of the world. I mean, not one stone left on top of another, this magnificent temple structure? Oh, there's no doubt that's the end of the time. I don't know, maybe not. What else could it be? Ask him. You ask him. And then finally, when they come to the Mount of Olives, it doesn't really tell us who. It just says the disciples came into him privately. Maybe they all kind of came up, and you can sort of picture Peter because he was the one who always would speak. Maybe it was Peter who said, Master, we have a question. Okay. And so they say, tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? And so you see why we say sometimes people will get to debating and discussing how many questions are asked here. Possibly as many as 3. When shall these things be? 1. What will be the sign of thy coming? 2. And of the end of the world? 3. Some people say it's all one question. They think, when will these things be? These things being the sign of your coming and the end of the world. And some people think they're asking 2 questions. When shall these things be? And breaking that down into 2 questions. What will be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? Be that as it may, again, I emphasize it really doesn't matter, and I've seen some people get into long discussions about how many questions are asked here. It doesn't matter. Jesus answers 2. He gives 2 answers. The first is in, what would that be, verses 4 through 35. And he ends that section with, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. And then he's going to shift, and you see it. You see the shift, because he says, but of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. And so Jesus is going to answer 2 different questions. What is going to be the sign of these things being the not one stone left on top of another? How are we going to know when that's going to happen? And then he's going to talk about his second coming and the end of time. And this is one of the reasons I go back and give so much repeat from 2 weeks ago, because this is so critical to understanding Matthew 24, because it gets misunderstood, and sometimes people will apply the earlier verses up through verse 35, and they'll talk about signs of the end of time. And it's just a contextual misunderstanding of what Jesus is talking about here. Because people will say, and I've told the Bremen folks before that, when I used to work the phones at Blue Cross, sometimes people would call in, and especially if something came up and I mentioned that I was, preaching part-time and doing some associate work there in the Chattanooga area where we were living at the time, and people would sometimes say things like, they'd mention something and say, it's just all this signs of the end, just like Jesus said. And I would sometimes even say, What exactly are you referring to? Well, and sometimes people would say, I can't remember exactly where it is. Sometimes people say, I think it's in Matthew 24. And they'll say things like, nation shall rise against nation. That's what Jesus says there in verse 7. Oh, and sometimes people would say, just like Jesus said, you'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. That's in verse 6. Nation rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines, pestilences, earthquakes in diverse places there in verse 7. Sometimes people would talk about many false prophets shall rise and shall deceive many. And people would say things like that to me. But what is Jesus talking about in that context? He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And that's when these things came to pass, that one stone was not left on top of another. The Jews, some of them, not all, but there was seemingly always an element among the Jews. We call them now, and well, they called them that then too, zealots. They wanted to overthrow Rome. And in John chapter 6, you have an element, at least a portion of them, that are there as Jesus feeds the 5,000. And John records how Jesus perceived that they wanted to take him by force and make him a king. It's not saying they wanted to force him to be a king, although they certainly would have been okay with that as well. But they wanted to take him by force of arms and make him king. King of kings. This is the Messiah. That was their view of the Messiah. That was a lot of folks' view of the Messiah, and it sometimes still is. Sometimes people still have this idea of Jesus coming back to conquer on this earth. But Jesus, over and over again, he would point out to people, my kingdom is not of this world. In fact, that's what he told Pilate. Pilate started questioning him, John 18:36. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews, but now is my kingdom not from hence. It's not an earthly kingdom. It doesn't involve earthly fighting. It's a spiritual kingdom. And so in John chapter 6, you'll see Jesus retreat from the multitude, not because he doesn't care about feeding them anymore, not because he doesn't care about teaching them anymore, but you see this time and time again in the gospel accounts. And in fact, I've got it in a quote here from R.C. Foster in his Studies in the Life of Christ. Is one of the quotes I printed out to mention in my morning sermon. But here's how he puts it. Whenever the excitement began to reach fever heat, Jesus usually changed his location and started a revival in some other locality. The people were so intent on a Messiah who would lead them in battle against the Roman legions that excitement had to be kept within bounds while he broke down their false conceptions of the Christ and taught them the spiritual character of the kingdom. Political revolution and bloodshed, never very far beneath the surface in Judea during the Roman occupation, must be restrained. And so Jesus is telling them what's going to happen, because it's going to reach a point. The Jews continually rebelling, especially those zealots, and the zealots were they're always trying to recruit people to their cause. What we need to do, we don't need to just go along with this Roman occupation. We need to rise up against them, throw off the burden of Rome ruling over us, and become great again like in the days of Solomon. Oh, and one day, the Christ is going to come, and he's going to lead that, and we will be free, and we'll be great again like in the days of Solomon. But you see how that is all centered around an earthly leader, an earthly kingdom. And Jesus over and over again is saying, my kingdom, it's not an earthly kingdom, it's not of this world. And eventually, around AD 70, Rome gets fed up. We sometimes will say in the South, I don't know if it's just a Southern expression, but we sometimes will say, I've had my fill of that, I've got a bait of that, and I'm done. My mom was kind of famous for saying to me growing up, you're getting on my last nerve. And when you're on the last nerve, you're on dangerously thin ice with mama. Well, the Jews got on Rome's last nerve, and they pushed it too far. And so Rome comes and sends a massive force. And they said, no more just bringing them into subjection. There were cities in Rome that were they were content to be Romans. In fact, proud to be Romans. Some cities even had certain privileges, governmental privileges, such as Ephesus. And you'll see this in the book of Acts when there's an uproar in Ephesus and the town clerk calls the people together and says, hey, y'all need to calm down. Because Rome doesn't like gatherings and things that even remotely resemble a riot or something like that, some kind of protest. And Rome's going to get wind of this and hear about it, and we might lose our status as what they called a free city. But listen, Jerusalem, all the Judean area, Palestine, we sometimes refer to it, they never had free city status because they were constantly had an element at least that wanted to uprise and to have an uprising, to rise up against Rome. But Rome gets their fill of it. They send the soldiers and they say, it's not going to be just bring them into subjugation. It's not going to be just to put down this element of the zealots. We're done. We're leveling this place. And so they went in and they know you want to get to the zealots. This all centers around them saying, oh, we're going to get rid of Rome because our Messiah is going to come and he's going to cast off Rome. And that all centered around that, and that all centered around the temple, which they viewed as God's house. And it was, but it wasn't like God. God is a spirit, John 4:24. He doesn't dwell in some physical structure. That represented his presence. And even just before the Jews went into captivity to Babylon, Ezekiel has this vision. I think it's about Ezekiel 10, maybe really like 8 through 10. But Ezekiel has this vision, and he's taken in the spirit to Jerusalem, and he sees all these just atrocious things that are going on even within the temple of God itself. But in that vision, he sees the Spirit of God leaving the temple. And there was a meaning behind that. God is saying, it ain't my house anymore. That's your house, Judah, and you have defiled it. And guess what? Nebuchadnezzar's coming, and it's going to be leveled. Oh, nothing can happen to God's house. That's true in a sense, but God says it ain't my house anymore. And similar wording, in fact, at the very end of Matthew 23, that is leading into this discussion in Matthew 24. What does Jesus say, verse 37? O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, and ye would not. Listen to what he says in verse 38. Behold, what? What's the next word? Your house is left unto you desolate. Oh, we are God's house. We're God's people. Well, as long as you follow what God says. But when you decide to just go your own way, do your own thing, he says, you're not my people. Sometimes it's popular when I've seen it. Sometimes we associate it with one president or another. I've seen it with several just in my lifetime, in my adult lifetime. But sometimes somebody gets elected. And, no matter who gets elected, there's going to be a group of people that think it's the worst choice in the history of mankind for a leader of the country. And it's become popular in the last, 10 years or so. People will, after the election, they'll buy bumper stickers. And it may be a little hashtag, or it may just be a bumper sticker, but it'll say, not my president. Which is interesting to me because if it ain't your president, well, why are you still here? Sometimes people say that too. Well, if so-and-so gets elected, I'm leaving the country. They always stay. Isn't that interesting? They never follow through on that. But that's popular. Not my president. Well, first of all, if I'm an American citizen, that's my president. If I'm going to be that way about it, I just need to surrender my citizenship and go somewhere else. I don't always like the choice, but Romans 13 says the powers that be are ordained of God, and so God's in control either way. But it's like God is saying to Israel regarding the temple, not my house. That's your house, and your house is left unto you desolate. And so again, similar language there to what you see, at least similar imagery, we'll put it that way, to what you see in Ezekiel. So Jesus, he gives all these signs, and we won't go through every single one, but so many of these that you hear people talk about even to this day and say, well, these are signs of the end. Watch out, it must be any day now. And I've heard that all my life. I'm 46 years old. I've heard that as long as I can remember. People will talk about, I got to where sometimes that when I was working at Blue Cross and somebody would mention it, they'd say, and they talk about signs, and I'd say, well, what signs? Well, Jesus talked about trouble in the Middle East. And I got to where sometimes I would just kind of say, well, when has there not been trouble in the Middle East? That's just an area that's seemingly always in turmoil. Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, and he gives some very specific signs. He even talks about verse 15, when you shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place. Whoso readeth, let him understand. And if we had more time, we could talk about that and Luke's account, talking about the Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem and Roman Gentile people coming into the temple of God, and that seems to be what he's talking about there, this abomination of desolation. But what does he say in verse 16 to do when you see that? Flee into the mountains. Well, again, I pointed this out 2 weeks ago, but if that's the end of time, what good is fleeing to the mountains going to do you? No good to do that. If it's the end of time, it's the end of time, and it's judgment. You can flee to the mountains, it won't do you any good. But Jesus says, this is what you need to do, flee to the mountains. He even goes on to say, if you're on the housetop, don't come down and take anything out of the house, verse 17. If you're in the field, don't return back to take clothes. Don't say, well, I got to go get my clothes. I need to pack some clothes for this trip. He says, no. When you see that, again, putting it with Luke, the Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem, he says, get out of Dodge. Then he says, woe unto them that are with child, to them that are nursing in those days. Well, that's going to hinder travel. He says, then shall be great tribulation, verse 20. Pray that your flight be not in the winter, again, hindering travel, neither on the Sabbath day, because the gates will be closed to the city, again, hindering travel. Then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Well, again, all of this it doesn't make sense if it's the end of time and Jesus' return. He says there are going to be people that will be saved. The days will be shortened. The last day is just that. It's the last day. That's it. And as we pointed out numerous times, we don't have record of any Christians that perished in the destruction of Jerusalem because they listened. They listened to Jesus. They saw the signs, and they got out of there. So he goes on to say, if any man shall say unto you, lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not, for there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if it were possible, they should deceive the very elect. But listen to what he says, behold, I have told you before. Sometimes we'll tell somebody something, we'll say, hey, listen up, let everybody remember, I warned you. Everybody remember when this happens, I told you, I predicted it. Sometimes we say that about things that are pretty obvious. Jesus, of course, is saying this through a miraculous knowledge, being the Son of God, God in the flesh. But he says, if they say to you, behold, he's in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he's in the secret chambers, believe it not. That's in verse 26. And he says in verse 28, wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. We would say here in the South, where the carcass is, there will the buzzards be circling. Sometimes growing up, we'd be out in my uncle's pasture, and you could see just little ways over, buzzards just circling. Well, we knew Uncle Ted's he's lost a cow or a bull or something. Something's dead over there because they're circling, or else it's very near death. And that's the idea here. This nation is near death, and the buzzards are circling. And when the death occurs, the buzzards will come in for the feast. He says, immediately after tribulation, those days shall the sun be darkened, moon shall not give her light. Verse 29, stars shall fall from heaven, powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Sometimes people read that and they say, oh, look at that language. I mean, the sun darkened, moon not giving light, stars falling from heaven, powers of the heavens be shaken. This is what we call apocalyptic language. And it's language that is always highly symbolic. And it always has to do with, I like the way one person put it. I don't know where I first heard this term, but it always deals with sort of a changing of the guard, changing of powers. And of course, here the power being the nation, the economy of Israel, the Israeli economy falling utterly. And so you have this apocalyptic language, and that also would drive home to the original readers in a very distinct way just how serious this situation is. And so he kind of wraps up this section, verse 32, learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh, summer is near. So likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. And then he says, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. And so again, it's going to happen in that lifetime. Well, that was 2,000 years ago. So again, I know it can't be the second coming of Jesus in the end of time, because here we are 2,000 years later. Those people have died and gone to their reward, but Jesus has not returned. Time has not ended. But AD 70 did, in fact, happen, of course, the destruction of Jerusalem. Heaven and earth shall pass away, verse 35, but my words shall not pass away. And then he completely shifts gears. After he just says about this parable of the fig tree, it has leaves, you know, summer is nigh. When you see all these, so likewise, when you see all these things, know that it's at hand, even at the doors. Then he turns right around and says, but of that day and hour knoweth no man. If he's talking about, sometimes, again, people apply this entire chapter to the end of time and the second coming of Christ. But if it were that statement makes no sense, especially right on the heels of saying, when you see these things, know that it's at hand, at the doors. Oh, but of that day and hour knoweth no man. And so you see a complete shift. And he's going to give another illustration. He gave the illustration of the fig tree so that you can know when the destruction of Jerusalem is at hand. But he gives another illustration to illustrate the second coming in the end of time. That illustration being the old patriarch Noah. And so he says, just like in the days of Noah, Old King James has Noe, but it's talking about Noah, of course. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Well, in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, till the day that Noah entered into the ark, knew not until the flood came, and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. And then he uses language just to describe how stark the separation will be in that day when the Lord does return, and it's the end of time. It'll be as if two were in the field, one taken, the other left. Two women grinding at the mill. Using this, we've talked before in a separate class about these. There were some millstone type situations. I say millstone, it actually was multiple stones, but it was for grinding grain, and it was so large, certain kinds were large enough that they needed to be operated by two people, and so there was kind of like a back and forth sort of. It's not really similar, but the best comparison I can think of is one of those big saws where, you had two people, one goes back, one goes forth, and something at least remotely similar to that. But one taken, the other left. Watch therefore, verse 42, for you know not what hour your Lord doth come. Well, he just gave all those signs for the destruction of Jerusalem. But for the second coming of Christ and the end of time, he says, watch. Be on guard. Be ready. Live your life in preparation. And I think it's worth mentioning here, and it really is nearly necessary to mention here, that for so many people, think of the millions, maybe more like billions, in the 2,000 intervening years from then till now, that the Lord hasn't returned, time hasn't ended, but what happens to us all? Hebrews 9:27. It's appointed unto men once to die, and after this the judgment. And so for you and for me, if the Lord tarries when we leave this life, that's essentially the same thing. It's as if, because that's the end of opportunity, and the Bible clearly teaches that. So, all that just to say, should we be living our lives in a state of readiness? Because we have no promise of tomorrow. People die every day. Some of them very old, full of years. Some of them young. Some middle-aged. Some teenaged. Some young adult, and so on. We don't know when our time is coming, whether it be the end of time and the return of Jesus, or whether it be the end of our time here on this earth. So he says, watch, be ready. He gives another, I guess you could call it like a parable, illustration at least. Know this, if the goodman of the house had known in what watch the thief would have come, he would have watched and would not have suffered his house to be broken up. Well, you know, if you've ever been robbed, we were robbed once in our house in Chattanooga, robbed during the Sunday evening worship. We came home from Sunday night service and found our house had been broken into and a bunch of stuff had been taken. The joke was on them because we'd only been married about a year. We didn't have much of anything. They didn't find much to take, but they took what they could, I'll tell you that. But, you know, if we had known, we could have been ready. Hey, Mr. Policeman, could you keep an eye on our house? There's a thief coming by sometime tonight. I think it's going to be around 6 o'clock when we're at church. But that's not how it works with a thief, right? They come unawares. And so he goes on and continuing that thought, he says, therefore be ye also ready, verse 44, for in such an hour as you think not, the Son of Man cometh. Here's our next question in this chapter. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his Lord hath made ruler over his household to give them meat in due season? So he asks the question, who is the faithful and the wise servant? Who will be given responsibility and blessed? Well, he tells us in verse 46, blessed is that servant whom his Lord, when he cometh, shall find so doing. So doing what? Living in watchfulness, readiness, preparedness, a state of preparation for his Lord's coming. You know it, I know it, we've all been there. We've worked in a job where the boss is not around, and some of the folks, I mean, it's like a party, it's goofing off, it's anything but what our responsibility is and what we're supposed to be doing, and the door opens, or maybe a car pulls up and they see it outside. Oh, it's the boss, and all of a sudden everybody's pulled up their company documents, and they're working and they're diligent, or you know, maybe even in a construction type situation, here comes the foreman, and everybody looks like they're really busy. Maybe they've just been sitting around talking before that. We've all seen that. Maybe we've been there. But he says the faithful servant is the one who works the same when the boss is nowhere to be found. You could know the boss is out of town. You could know the boss is out of the country. But you're working the same as if he's standing right there by your side. That is faithful Christian living. And that's still true today, whether it's talking about the work of the church, or whether it's talking about my work in my home, or whether it's talking about my work in the secular field. Working just as if the boss is standing right beside me. And so he says, verily I say unto you that he shall make him, that faithful servant, ruler over all his goods. Listen to what he says though. But and if that evil servant shall say in his heart, here's a contrast. What if he's not? What if he's the type of person that works differently if the boss is around? If that evil servant shall say in his heart, my Lord delayeth his coming, and shall begin to smite his fellow servants, and to eat and drink with the drunken, he's partying, the boss is away. The Lord of that servant shall come in a day when he looketh not for him, and in an hour that he is not aware of, and shall cut him asunder, and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you ever been, maybe you're like me, I mean this has never happened to me, but I have a cousin, okay? This has happened to him before. As a kid, you're doing something that you know is not at all acceptable. and you are going to be in big trouble, but hey, mom's not around, and you're just having a good time. Maybe you've had friends over you're not supposed to have over, and a car pulls in the driveway. And oh my stars, mama has come home early. What are we going to do? Nothing we can do. We are busted. And that is a scary feeling, I'm told. We know what that's like. But if you're doing what you're supposed to do, living how you're supposed to live, whether it's death, the end of time, the second coming of Christ, it holds no fear. It just holds hope, because that's time to go home. That's Jesus' point. Destruction of Jerusalem, verses 3 through 35. Second coming of Christ, verses 36 through the rest of the chapter. And those two questions in Matthew 24 center around those two events. But the idea there, as he closes out in Mark chapter 13, the parallel account, he says, what I say unto you, I say unto all, watch. In other words, be ready. Thank y'all very much. We'll have a break before worship this morning.